what I think is really interesting in your work is to try to combine these three elements. On the one hand, this ongoing investigation of perception, of how we understand who we are as humans, as beings in the world, and how we perceive our being in the world as a mode of relation, and how this is negotiated constantly, also through perception, or how perception, let's say, allows us as being human beings as a whole, but also as individuals, to understand where we are, who we are, and how we exist. So it's a kind of a new phenomenology where ecology plays a very important role to understand situatedness. And then there is this other aspect that is that investigation is in permanent dialogue with the knowledge traditions of science, how science understands the world and generates understanding for other people, and hopefully also a way of existing that is more sustainable and more balanced, especially in a moment such as ours, as we have never been so aware of how each of our gestures bears a consequence to all other living forms, and that how much of what we've been doing has been so damaging for ourselves and for the planet. And then there is the language and the poetics of art, that is somehow operating through this interest in perception and this sort of also curiosity and investment in understanding scientific approaches to the world. And in this sense, looking at an installation and a work such as the Sentinel Self is a very good case for us to understand how an artwork is capable in itself of being a Sentinel Self, in itself of being an element that stands in these different thresholds and that is capable of rendering your own investigation into something else. So more than anything, this is a long question to just ask you to tell us a little bit more about how this work functions, and yes, how you conceived it, and how you conceived it spatially and in the way it functions in relationship to its visitors.
Yeah, it was really inspired by a small little experiment that I got to do on my last project together with Heather and Juan, which was to grow my own immune cells in vitro. So we took out some of my blood, and you're actually not supposed to do this in the scientific tradition. You're not supposed to experiment on yourself, but it's happened a lot also in the past. And so I had this opportunity both to kind of like over weeks and weeks nourish my immune cells outside of my body, which involves a lot of kind of like liquidy, squirty, bringing liquid from one container to another. Actually, a lot of plastic was involved in it. But in the end, what we had was this condensed little vial of my immune cells that you can see here. And then as part of their experiment, they would feed them microplastics and see what would these cells do to the microplastics. And what the cells do is that they're almost like little Pac-Man creatures that like move around in the petri dish and start eating the microplastics. So you can see this one has already started eating one, and what I remember was like just feeling both very exhilarated that I got that experience, but also how strange it was that something that had been inside of me and had evolved with me since childhood, and since before childhood, since I was like an embryo maybe, and then now it was outside of my body, but it was still going on to perform this task that it somehow knew how to do, and I was just amazed. Like, is it still me? Like, is it still me once it's full of microplastics? Like it just brought so many levels of like confusion about what a self is, and I kind of wanted to bring that experience into to for others to experience as well. But obviously I can't take everybody's immune cells and grow them in vitro, and maybe not also wouldn't be so interesting. But then I started. I actually read about the work of this artist Ian Cheng, and his use of simulations, and then I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Like if I could create a kind of like similar sense of something that's connected with me, but that's also somehow out there in the world and is part of some kind of ecosystem itself, that will also surprise me along the line, almost like having looking into a freshwater pond and seeing all the changes and things that happen there, and the influences from the larger ecosystem. So that was really the starting point for the Sentinel Self, which is a simulation that's based on both a freshwater ecosystem, but also some kind of immune system, where each of these agents that you encounter in this world have some sort of um, desire to maintain homeostasis in the environment. So the main kind of characters are the antigen presenting cells, but they're also shaped as freshwater Daphnia, which are water fleas that are also keystone species in freshwater ecology, and they move around this world and pick up antigens from pathogens and bring them to lymph nodes, and in the lymph nodes they meet the T cells, and the T cells then know what to do because they get information, and then they go out into the world, and the world continues to have this kind of equilibrium in some sense. But then there's also this plastic bag creature that is actually a scan of a plastic bag that I found on the beach where I live, and that kind of like weaves in and out of this kind of like semi porous, semi-fluid worlds, and leaves behind a trail of microplastics. And everything that's alive in the world has a kind of like similar oscillation, and all the T cells and even the pathogens, they have this kind of similar kind of oscillation that they can communicate to each other with. But the microplastics has a fundamentally slower oscillation, so they sort of like drag all these other agents into their orbit or into their temporality somehow, and when that happens over time, they turn these little Daphnia slash antigen presenting cells into fossils, and from their fossil state they're sort of staying dormant until the ecosystem can somehow repair itself. It's very much a work in progress, but I was kind of interested in like, yeah, how could I create this kind of like dynamic evolving system, and then how could I also try and make this kind of very personal connection that I felt with my immune cells. So I work with a lot of people. I worked with an interaction designer, Sam Bilbo, where we try to bring people's heart rates or heartbeat into the world, so that the heartbeat would also kind of like feed into this idea of the oscillating, interconnected environment. And I worked with a artist and developer, George Sims, who gave all of these different creatures a sort of will, or scripted them to go through the world and try to create this sense of homeostasis. I also worked with Jonathan Roos, who's a sound artist and composer, who created little voices that were based on his own voice for each of these creatures. So they they became really animated somehow, and when I look at the simulation, I really care about them, and I actually feel pretty bad when they get sort of like plasticized. So I think I will need to develop um, some sort of enzyme or something that they might be able to evolve into having, so that they can get rid of the plastics. And a lot of the work is inspired indeed by my collaboration with Juan, who's the immunologist, who has shared with me his concerns about what might happen to our immune cells when they encounter microplastics. And one of them indeed is that our bodies have evolved with microbes and with pathogens. So the pathogens might overtake the equilibrium that the immune system is trying to preserve in the body. But nevertheless, the immune cells still know how to recycle pathogens. So they have enzymes within them that they can use to take the pathogens apart into little tiny bits and recycle them in the body, but they don't know. We haven't evolved with plastic, so they don't know how to do that.
But I was curious about something in relation to your collaboration and dialogue with scientists and with researchers who are very grounded in an epistemological tradition that is, let's say, it's different from that of the arts. And my question is, how do you manage not to get distracted by science? In the sense, how do you manage to have an artistic practice when being, which sometimes I imagine you are overwhelmed by the information, the fascinating data and knowledge that those who work in the different fields of science share with you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I love actually working with certain kinds of scientists. And Heather and Juan were definitely the kind of scientists that I love working with, because they're also so much more than scientists. That's their job, but they're also garden freaks, or they are, really into science fiction, I found out. So when we first started working together, I was actually the one who kind of came a bit with sort of like what Heather called a biofix, or like a design fix, where I was like, oh, we have all these microplastics in our bodies. Maybe we make a speculative project about, some microbe that co-inhabit and then eats the microplastics from our bodies. And she was like, well, why do we have to delegate that job to microbes? They have their own life worlds, like why do so she was actually really challenging me to think like way outside the box. And then we ended up in sort of like science fiction, and she said that that was so liberating to her, because she is also kind of caught, sometimes she feels, in these kind of scientific, what needs to be scientifically rigorous methods. But of course, she also sits and stares at this weird material all day and wonders, like what's going to happen in 200 years. And, and then in our collaboration, she had an ability to express that, which I thought was really beautiful. It also required that we were really honest with each other about what was science fiction and what was science, and especially somebody like Juan, who works in immunology and worked in vaccine research and things like that. It was really important for him to also make it clear to an audience, that this is science fiction, So the previous work we did was a science fiction about two researchers that ingest microplastics and realize that it has hallucinatory effects of returning to the primordial sea. And to me, obviously, I was like, yeah, nobody's gonna think that, microplastics have psychotropic effects. And, it was like a nod at J.D. Ballard and this kind of like weird climate fiction kind of things. But I could also understand it from his point of view, that his field of research come under scrutiny a lot. So So he wanted to have clean lines. So I think for this kind of art science collaborations to work, you need to be really understanding of each other's fields and have an open discussion about it. But then I think it can be really inspiring, actually.
It can indeed. I remember in the beginning of the pandemic, I was meant to write a text about what was happening, and I was very overwhelmed, as everyone was, with what was happening. And I was interviewing a researcher, a virologist from the Rockefeller Institute in New York about the virus, and she's an expert in she's an expert in viruses, and at a certain point she said, well, why don't you ask yourself what the virus wants and write a text about that? And I was like, you're a scientist, you should be. It's like, you have the freedom to do that. I try to ask that as a scientist. What do these viruses want?
Yeah.
And that's my work. And because they must want something. And I thought, that's so interesting. And that generated one of the texts that most people have told me that they've read about my work, which is called What the Virus Wants. And but it's exactly through a scientist who told me, like, you have the creative freedom to do something that I try to do with my work as a researcher in a different way and frame it in a different way, but you can do it in whatever way you want. And so that the collaboration, I think, is really interesting, because we share questions, but then our methodologies allow us to just go in different ways.
I was really fascinated by that different view of the immune system that's not so based on war metaphors, but that's more based on this kind of like, I guess more ecosystem way of thinking. Because I think if we thought less of our bodies as these kind of fortresses or boundaries, then it's very clear, that we've seen microplastics being a huge problem in the oceans for decades and decades, and all kinds of other aquatic species have been the sentinel selves to this microplastic pollution and to human plastic addiction. But we come from the water and we are completely interconnected with water. So it's not very surprising, that our bodies will also eventually be housed to microplastics.
It's beautiful what you're saying, and it also made me think, again, connecting myth and science, how if we think how microplastics derive from petroleum derivatives, and how petroleum comes from, well, they're fossil fuels, no? So they come from our ancestors and the ancestors of the world. It's almost like the sickness that is happening to our bodies and to the bodies of the planet comes in a different narrative parallel to that of science, to a sort of a disturbance that we did to our ancestors, and this is a curse that we did, because we shouldn't have disturbed our ancestors, and instead our extractive greed created this complex situation that we can. The stories of science, or the stories that myth or art tell, are all just teaching us that we need to find other ways to relate to the world, beyond thinking that extraction is a way to progress, which is not. So I hope, I can only hope that works and words like ours, like yours, and can contribute for this change of consciousness that is much, much needed. Yeah.